we've mentioned wattage a few times so far. When we're talking about our power supply unit, we've said you want to make sure that you have the correct wattage for your power supply unit. What's a way that we can describe that as far as how computers work, how electricity works? Well, when we're talking about wattage is an amount of electrical power, the amount of work that electrical power is doing. And it's commonly expressed as volts times amps. So that doesn't help us if we don't really understand what volts or amps do. So let's use a little bit of an illustration. When we're talking about amps, we're really talking about our potential. Using the illustration, say, of a fire hose or a garden hose, our amps would sort of be the diameter of our hose. Think of, say, a garden hose versus a actual fire hose. The diameter on our fire hose is going to be a lot bigger than the diameter on our garden hose. So even if we're pushing out the same amount of pressure of water through that garden hose as we are the fire hose, we're going to get a lot more water through the fire hose than we would the garden hose. We can even tone down the pressure on our fire hose and still match the water output, the wattage, on our different hoses. Now that pressure that we're talking about, the water pressure, is going to be the volts. So we have our garden hose and we have our fire hose. Our garden hose is a 2-inch diameter hose and our fire hose is a 1-foot diameter hose. And we're pushing out, we're filling up 2-gallon buckets a minute with both of those hoses. That pressure behind the water hose is going to have to be a lot more powerful in order to keep up with the fire hose. But if they both opened up the same amount of water pressure, the fire hose would significantly outmatch that garden hose. So we can see how when we're talking about wattage, the total amount of water that we're getting out of each of those hoses, amps and volts both come into play. The hose diameter and the pressure behind the water coming out of that hose both come into account. They both make up what our total wattage is. Now that we know what wattage is for our power supply units, we need to make sure that when we're getting a power supply unit, when we're purchasing one for our computer, we have the right amount of wattage. So how do we determine that? Well, what really comes in handy when we're trying to determine the wattage is something called a wattage calculator. You can find these a lot of times online when you're browsing different power supply units, and they assist us in determining how much wattage our computer needs. The wattage can consist of things like our different expansion slots or different PCI slots, the type of CPU that we're using, what type of motherboard that we're using, any lights that are on the outside casing of our computer, any fans that we have. All of these come into play when we're talking about the total wattage that our computer is using. So we're designing our own computer. We've decided that we figured out what wattage our board is, and we've determined what our current need is for power. When we're purchasing our power supply unit, it's best to purchase one that our total max output is at around 50% of the power supply unit's max output. Now, this allows our power supply unit to work at peak performance, and it also allows room for improvement. Say we want to add on an additional video card later, or we add an additional fan in our computer and a couple of sound cards. All of these things are going to begin drawing more power than we initially anticipated when we set up our computer. So having that room for expansion gives us more freedom, because even if we add 30% more power consumption on our computer, we're still going to be running about 80% of our max power supplies units output, and we'll still see our peak performance on our computer, and we won't see any issues due to lack of power running through our motherboard. Another one of our considerations when we're purchasing a power supply unit is going to be the size of the power supply unit. Different cases fit, our different power supply units will fit our different case types. Our two most common sizes are going to be our ATX as well as our micro ATX. Now, our ATX power supply unit is actually going to be a little bit slightly larger than our micro ATX unit. Again, these are just our form factors for our power supply. So depending on the type of case that we have, depending on the connectors that we have in order to put our power supply unit in the case, we want to do a little bit of research and make sure that we're getting the right type of power supply unit that fits in our case. Again, the other common size that we'll see will be our micro ATX, which will be a smaller square shape, only a little bit slightly smaller in length than our ATX unit. And the micro ATX unit we'll see on some of our desktop computers. And we want, again, to make sure that we're doing the proper research when we're determining the size of our power supply unit. Some high-end performance computers may have specially designed, specially built and shaped power supply units that come with prefabricated, say a prefabricated gaming computer or a specialized desktop computer that we get from our manufacturer. So these may not always be as easily replaceable as one that uses a standard ATX or micro ATX, because they're actually using a specially designed, specially configured, shaped power supply unit. Now, our next consideration when we're talking about picking our power supply unit is going to be the connectors that we have on our power supply unit. When we say our connectors, we're talking about our plugs that we have coming out of our power supply unit that allow us to supply power to the different components in our computer. Now, these connectors, we want to make sure first that we have the right type of connectors for our board. If we have, say, a 20-pin main power on our motherboard, we want to make sure that we get a power supply unit that provides us with that connector. Or if it's a 24-pin main board power supply, we want to make sure we have that type of connector. We want to match them up as best as possible so we aren't using a lot of different converters inside of our unit. We aren't using a lot of different Y connectors. We want to make sure that what we're getting when we purchase our power supply unit matches what we need on our board as far as connectors. We don't always want to get a power supply unit with exactly the right number of connectors for the things that we need for our computer, because again, we might need more. We might need a higher end graphics card later on down the road that requires its own dedicated power. We might be using an additional sound card or an additional fan in our computer, and we need that extra power connector. If push comes to shove, we can purchase what are called Y splitters, which actually take a certain connector coming out of our power supply unit and split that into two separate power cables. Now, these Y splitters aren't recommended for multiple use. We don't want to take a Y splitter on a Y splitter on a Y splitter, because eventually we're degrading that power that we're getting through those cables so much that we're going to notice issues with our performance on our board, or we'll notice issues with the performance of the fan that we have connected to that, or our extra video card. So we want to keep those to a minimum and just draw that initial power straight from the connectors that are coming directly out of the power supply unit. In addition to buying power supply units with the connectors already installed on the ends, with the cables coming straight out of the power supply units, we also have power supply units which they're more customizable. They're sort of our blank power supply units. So when we're talking about these customizable blank units, rather than buying a power supply unit that out of the box has cables coming out of the back with multiple different connectors on the ends, we're actually going to be talking about a power supply unit that out of the box just looks like this. And then on the actual back of the power supply unit, there are pin areas available for buying additional power supply cables that we plug into the power supply unit on one end and plug into our board on the other end. Now, keep this in mind, especially when you're buying your power supply units. If you want something out of the box that you can stick in your computer, plug in, and it's ready to go, you don't want to go with something that's already prefabricated like this. If you want something that's more customizable, will save some space in your computer. If you have rather than having unnecessary cables, you can actually just keep those off and keep the dedicated cables on your computer only when you need them. Then you're going to want to look for something that's more customizable, that just comes as like a blank power supply unit that you can add cables into later. So again, our overall considerations when we're purchasing our power supply unit is going to be our wattage. We're going to want to be at about 50% of our max power supply unit pushing power. We're going to look at our size, whether it's an ATX, a micro ATX, or if it's some sort of custom power supply unit from the manufacturer. And we're also going to look at the type of connectors that we have on there. We want to make sure that we have enough connectors, or if we're going to go with a customizable unit. And we want to keep all of these factors in mind when we're purchasing our power supply unit.